The film starts with Chris, who is on vacation. He meets a girl who has the same nature as him, and as a result, they start to like each other. Later, Chris and Annie get married, and now they had 2 children. One day their children don't return from school because they had died in the school bus accident. After their family disperses, Chris and Annie experience a trauma. Later, we see Chris in his hospital. He was observing a report of a child and receives a call from Annie, who informs him that today, she needed to receive 8 paintings to display at an exhibition. However, Annie was concerned since the paintings had not yet arrived. Chris asks her to calm down and says if her paintings did not arrive, put her paintings in the exhibition. Annie, on the other hand, does not agree with his idea and asks, "How could I show my paintings while they are all at home?" Chris tells her that after he is released from the hospital, he'll bring them from home. Annie is relieved that Chris has given his time for her. He also completes his tasks and leaves for Annie's paintings. While on road, he sees many flipped cars, and one of the cars has a lady in it. Chris wants to help the lady, but a car speedily collides with him. And Chris dies on the spot. Annie believes she was the cause of Chris's death and was heartbroken. Her children died first, and now her husband has passed away. She had no one with her and was considering herself defective. If she had gone to pick up her children from school, nothing would have happened to them. And her husband wouldn't have had an accident if she had not urged him to come fast. Meanwhile, Chris is seen with Annie. But it was Chris's soul, and he tries to communicate with her. Annie senses a shadow, and that shadow asks Chris to go away. But he replies he'll not go anywhere, he'll live with Annie. The shadow tells his name, Albert. Chris asks why I can't see you. He answers, you can see me whenever you want. Meanwhile, Annie is writing something for Chris. He wishes to realize her, his presence. He slid Annie's pen and says that I'm here and feel me. She begins to cry, and departs. She thinks it is simply her illusion, and Annie visits his grave the next day. Chris was also present, and he wishes her to feel his presence. Chris believes he's died and can't be seen by her because she tears a lot. He should proceed from there, and he departs. Later, we encounter Chris in an unusual world that was painted, and the shadow meets him there as well. Chris was able to see him, and his name was Albert. The world seems familiar to Chris because it is in fact Annie's artwork. This was the world in which Chris desired to live with Annie. Albert informs Chris that we reach our favorite place after death. Chris sees a house that was Annie's picture and desired to live with her there. Chris and Albert reach there. This world becomes normal after Albert creates a hole in it. Annie was painting while the world was being created. In the artwork, she creates a lovely tree. They are also influenced by this painting. He sees the lovely tree in his world as well. Albert informs him that you're soulmates, and that's why her painting has an impact on the globe. Now, Annie dislikes this artwork and pours water on it, causing the painting to vanish and the lovely tree to ruin Chris's world. The leaves of this tree shattered and Chris became sad. He learns that Annie is completely alone in this world. Meanwhile, Chris discovers a toy of his daughter in the world. He takes it and happily informs Albert that he will now be able to meet his daughter. Albert tells that this is the world in which everyone has created their world. Your children must have created their universe. Chris asks what I might do to meet my children. He can meet them whenever he wants, according to Albert. Later, a girl approaches Chris and informs him that Albert has sent her. Do you want to visit my world? He agrees and follows the girl, beginning to converse with him. Chris was not paying attention to her since he wanted to meet his daughter. She was telling him, and he recalls her daughter's heavenly home and realizes that this world looked a lot like that heaven house. He learns from the girl that she was flying with her father one day. Meanwhile, an Asian air hostess was on the scene. After seeing her, my father told her that Asian girls are very attractive and mature. And I've resolved to look like this flight hostess one day. After hearing this, Chris realizes that the girl is his daughter, Marie. Chris cries as he hugs his daughter. Later, Chris returns to his world, where he meets Albert. However, Albert appears to be concerned this time. And when he inquires, he is informed that his wife has taken her life. Chris is saddened and he tells Albert that she had no choice because she was alone in that world. Chris claims Annie would meet me for this reason. Meanwhile, Albert informs him that it is not like this, she took her own life. And will not come to heaven, but rather to hell, and you can't meet her. And after listening to this he says, I can't let her live in hell, she should live with me because I'm her soulmate. Albert claims that you are not permitted to enter that place, because whoever enters never returns. She has taken her life, and this is her world. Chris is adamant about meeting Annie, and Albert says you should have a chance. Albert claims that I'll find a guide who can assist you in entering heaven. Later, Albert takes him into a library where an old man will guide them. Chris along with Albert and the old man boards a ship. Their boat was passing from the sea, but the path was horrible. Long waves of the sea were hitting them and a large number of souls drove them into the water. Later, we see them on a beach, and Chris inquires as to which universe they are in. According to his guide, is the entrance to hell. The old man claims that he is not receiving any signal because Chris couldn't stop thinking about his son. He advises him to study and focus on his education to become a big man. Chris recognizes Albert as his son, and after his death, Albert continued to aid others, including his father. As soon as Chris recognizes him, his son embraces him and says, "You've practiced your medical by following Albert. Do you know why I'm Albert?" The old guy now informs Chris that Albert is unable to join us because Chris was before thinking about his wife more than his son. He should continue if he wants to meet his wife. Albert stops there and wishes his father to go to his mother. Chris discovers multiple heads stuck in the ground after visiting the place. Meanwhile, he notices Annie's head and wishes to visit her. The earth begins to crack as he approaches her. He later arrives at a house, recalling Annie's memories. That was a broken house, but upon closer inspection, he recalls that it was the dream house of Annie and him. Meanwhile, the old man says him not to stay long. "You can't stay here more than 3 minutes, because everything is based on Annie's memories. They'll be stuck here like Annie after 3 minutes. Furthermore, Annie has forgotten everything. This is why this house is broken." Chris only has 3 minutes to remind Annie of everything. Otherwise, he'll end up like Annie. He recognizes him as Dr. Albert after listening to the old man. Dr. Albert was the same person who guided him after he died. Later, Chris starts looking for Annie in this rundown house. He eventually locates Annie, who had been calling his name. When he comes across her, she doesn't recognize him. He told her over and over that he was her Chris. But she didn't recognize him and thought as if someone is showing himself as Chris. He tries to comprehend Annie, but she refuses to listen. He gives up and walks back to Albert, telling him that I've given up. The old man claims that this is your journey, not Annie's. You've been brought here to see that this is Annie's world, not yours. Your world is paradise, and you can no longer live together. You should join me in heaven as soon as possible. Chris claims that you've realized I've given up. But you couldn't see why I've given up. My defeat is that I am unable to let her remember me. But instead of going to heaven, I'll spend eternity with Annie in hell. He tells the old man that he should tell his children how much he loves them. Later, Chris approaches Annie and compliments her for being an outstanding wife. You've always taken care of your children and husband. You cared so much about us that you sacrificed your life after we left, and Chris was clutching Annie's hand. He was crying after stating all of this. Annie realizes that he is her Chris after listening to him. Annie's memories were now being restored, while Chris's memory was fading. Annie brought everything back to him. His eyes were closed before she could take him out of this world. But when he opens his eyes again, he is in heaven. He'd returned to the same place where he'd agreed to live with Annie. He was thinking that this was their fantasy place since he had arrived alone in heaven and Annie had gone alone in hell. Meanwhile, we see Annie, who was in heaven behind him. She later meets her children and becomes happy. In the last scene, we see Annie and Chris telling each other, "We should take a new life, and in that new life, we'll again be together. And we'll make our pretty world." Later we see 2 children, who are Chris and Annie. After taking a new life and they've found each other. The film ends here. Thank you for watching and don't forget to subscribe.